I'm Mark Toshner, a university lecturer in respiratory medicine and a consultant in both Addenbrooke's and Papworth hospitals. So today I'm going to very quickly give you a helicopter view of the challenges in experimental medicine in the midst of a pandemic. We'll do a lightning fast summary of the significant studies to date with an emphasis on recovery. And I'm going to give you some of my own personal opinions about what experimental medicine needs to do for the second wave. How we view the achievements to date depends on whether you're a glasses half full or a glasses half empty person. It can be viewed as borderline miraculous that 6 months on from the description of a completely new disease, we have 2 therapies through phase 3 and 1 promising therapy in phase 2. And these therapies tell us an awful lot about drug development and are incredibly instructive for the future. We have remdesivir, which is a classical drugs company asset, which has been tested in a very traditional pipeline. We have dexamethasone that has arisen from an investigator-led generic focused platform trial, and we have a phase 2 trial from a small biotech startup based in Southampton. So 3 very different trial designs looking at different aspects of endpoints in COVID. And I think had you told us 6 months ago that that was a possibility, we would definitely have accepted that. However, if you're a glasses half empty person, you can look at the 800 plus trials that have been registered on clinicaltrials.gov and International Trials Network. And with an accumulated planned enrolment of just under 500,000 patients, leads you to wonder why we've only ended up with 2 therapies. And I think that's inherent partly in drug discovery, but also demonstrates the scale of the challenge of trying to complete trials when you have a tsunami of patients approaching in a very short time frame. So those trials were very different from the perspective of where they were sponsored. So remdesivir was a classical drugs company design trial, and by that I mean multi-center, multinational, all the IP held within the company, and powered for a softer endpoint than the recovery trial that we'll come to in a second. That was effectively the recovery rate ratio, so how quickly patients recovered from the disease. And in reality, this ended up being dominated by the hospitalised days tally. So in other words, how quickly did patients get discharged from hospital? So that's a modest sized trial looking at a soft endpoint of how long the patients were actually in the hospital for. The drug had an unequivocally significant impact on recovery rate and therefore reduced hospitalised days. And though you can question the relevance of this to the patient and whether it has any long-term beneficial effect, it has an economic benefit for hospitals by reducing length of stays. However, the drug did not reduce the need for mechanical ventilation or ICU support, and they were not able to demonstrate a statistically significant improvement in mortality, although importantly the trial was not powered to be able to adequately comment on this, and you will see that the confidence intervals come quite close to overlapping. So this is very much a classical drugs company trial looking at an endpoint that's practical rather than necessarily the most important endpoint. but was the first therapy to demonstrate an improvement in COVID. The recovery trial, and I was involved in the recovery trial, helping set it up locally in Cambridge, was a completely different style of trial and with a completely different fundamental approach. So that is an open label randomized clinical trial platform, so that there was no placebo arm in this, but just a standard of care. And originally they'd planned to look at 3 different therapies, that was interferon, dexamethasone, and lopinavir, ritonavir, but the interferon was changed because of simple logistical reasons at the start, and hydroxychloroquine, which had gained a lot of attention in the press, was substituted in its stead. There were no initial power calculations submitted when it was very first put through its ethics approval, and the aim was to just accumulate as many patients as were feasible, with subsequent power calculations worked out during interim analysis. Its primary endpoint was hard mortality, and in fact this trial was set up very much with the pragmatic and practical design forefront, because the idea was to roll it out to as many trial sites as possible. And as you can see, they managed over 170 sites in the UK. This was a UK study alone, and enrolled just over 12,000 patients to date. So this brought with it its own challenges. This is a screenshot of our Slack group, and at its height, you can see there were 87 people contributing on a daily and weekly basis, because we were having to set a trial up in a matter of days rather than the usual months we had. And just to give you an understanding of the scale of the task there, the involvement of multiple departments, the involvement of multiple structural groups, the requirement for training, the necessity to try to keep communication going amongst all these different people, and the regulatory and governance issues that this sort of speed entailed were not inconsiderable. And if you think about the 87 people we had helping with this in Cambridge, and then multiply that up across 150 or 170 odd sites, the scale of this really becomes apparent. We won't go through the 2 negative arms, though both are important because we simply don't have time, but we will very quickly summarise the positive arm, and that was dexamethasone, 6 milligrams per kilogram. And as you can see, there was a significant improvement in mortality, although this was most notable when stratified by patients effectively symptomatic scoring or severity scoring, although this is a very low rent severity scoring because it effectively only has 2 levels: did you need oxygen and were you ventilated? And the most significant signal, rather surprisingly, certainly unexpectedly to most of us, was in patients who were mechanically ventilated. Lastly, I'm going to talk about very briefly the Synergene study, another UK success story, and that's a small company based in Southampton, supported by the UK Respiratory Translational Research Collaboration NIHR TRC, and that was a small, just over 100 patient double-blind RCT phase 2. We don't have the clinical data from this yet, but they have released a press release or summarising that there's a 79% reduction in mechanical ventilation and death with an odds ratio of 0.21. The p-value of 0.046 tells you that this is still likely to be a relatively small signal, and so I'll put the major caveat that we haven't actually seen the data yet, although I'm a member of the TRC and we have discussed some of it in that TRC. So what have we learned? I think if we're going to get anywhere near recruiting the sort of numbers that are registered, we're going to need an enormous amount of perhaps unprecedented cooperation. Platform trials work the best, multi-centre collaborative and ideally multinational trials are what we should be aiming for. all of this is happening in real time, and that presents a unique set of challenges. And this will not change for the second wave. In fact, it might get slightly more complicated because now we have some therapies. The next round of successful trials will have to incorporate those therapies into the standard of care. However, having demonstrated that we can do this, what we now need is industry, investigators, and biotech to all pull together and work in a way that has been historically difficult to envisage. Thank you.